the graphic live, so you can be on either mute if you want. But the video is not. They don't see. They just see the graphic. In other words. Yeah. Okay, just want to take a moment to welcome everyone that's in the Zoom chat room to remind everyone this is a recorded and syndicated program, which means it can be requested on demand through Zoom. And we also stream live via our Facebook page, BC underscore CSLE, BC underscore CSLE. Uh, Good morning to the BC community and our special guest, our parent Parents Engaging Parents Partners, who's also here in the chat room, and our guest who I've been looking forward to, Mrs. Danielle West-Augustin. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Terrence?
I'm great. And so we're excited to have you. We wanted to have you on campus, but virtually is just as good. Have you been engaging in a lot of Zoom meetings?
Oh my gosh, I think I'm on Zoom overload. But you know what? I am happy that we have this mode of communication available to us. Had this been some time ago and we didn't have Zoom, I'm not certain that we would be able to carry out still educating our scholars the way that we've been able to with Zoom. And even just connecting with our family and friends has been a really good thing. So I'm happy that Zoom is here.
Yes, so we'll get into it, but I'm sure that as a principal, you've had to use Zoom to communicate with your staff and obviously students. Are you communicating with parents via Zoom as well?
We have communicated with our parents whatever via whatever platform is available to them. With some families working here in Plainfield, it's been literally just a phone call. With some families, we have been able to contact them via Zoom. We held our first virtual report card night last week, and it was mainly via Zoom as well as phone calls for some of the parents that are not as tech savvy, but we still needed to communicate with them.
That's great to hear. I want to start off by just reading a little bit from your bio to tell the audience who you are, and if you don't mind. And so, formally, I would like to introduce, first of all, my name is Terrence Bengston. I am the interim director for the Center for Student Leadership and Engagement at Bloomfield College in New Jersey. And we are excited to have been able to, and blessed to have been able to launch our virtual engagement series and have some dynamic leaders from really all different walks of life throughout the state of New Jersey willing to come on campus, excited to come on campus to share with not just our staff and faculty, but our most prized community members, our students. With that being said, as Danielle is a Chief Academic Officer and Director for the Queen City Academy Charter School, she is responsible for carrying out the district and school goals to increase the academic achievement of students and maintain high levels of school morale. Danielle West holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Human Services and also in Human Services, I'm sorry, from Lincoln University, and a Master's of Arts in Educational Administration degree from St. Peter's College. As an educator and long-time learner, her mission is to advocate for and empower the youth under her charge. She is an esteemed member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, which our president is too, so I know that she's excited to hear that, and the National Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa. Again, welcome, Danielle. So we talked a little bit about you being a principal, but I just wanted to give some time for you to talk a little bit about your background before college, before attaining your BA and your master's degree. Who was Danielle growing up in her community?
Well, I've always been civically engaged and active, hence how I have come to know you. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I am a lifelong resident of the city. And growing up, I've always been engaged and involved, whether it was working with one of our former council people, who was Councilman Donald Bradley, and volunteering in his office, or working with the NAACP with Get Out the Vote, back when, oh gosh, that was maybe when McGreevey was in office, I think, and it was Take Your Souls to the Polls. And I always look at being civically involved as a obligation, but being an obligation because when we can engage civically, we build our communities. And not only do we get to know people, but we get to know their needs and what it is that we can do to assist and work together, because I don't believe that anyone can do anything alone. We all need to work together, because when you work in silos, you miss the mark somehow. There might be something that you forget. My grandmother used to always say, you know, two heads are better than one, right? So I really like to believe that. And with that being the case, I've always been engaged and involved in community organizations in the city of Newark. And now that's expanded a bit because I am leading a charter school that's in Union County in Plainfield. So I have gotten to know Union County. And I've done that because I look at our school as not just being here to educate students, but our school is really here to also help build a community. We find that, especially in our urban centers, sometimes that has gotten lost along the way, that the school used to be a place of a beacon in the community. It wasn't just a place that you came to learn your ABCs, but it was also a place that helped to mobilize the community. So that's how I like to look at education, as well as being a vehicle to create generational success, but also being a means to help mobilize the community and help to build a community.
Tell us about your time at, say, Lincoln University. What were you like as a student? What were some of the things you were involved in? You're smiling. Tell us some college stories.
You know, I think in order to tell the college story, I have to go back a little bit to the high school story. So in high school, I went to a predominantly, while I lived in Newark, I went to a parochial school that was an all-girls Catholic high school. I was one of 5 students of color in my graduating class. I think that had a huge impact about why I knew I needed to go to an HBCU. Not that I didn't know who I was, or because my family, my parents made sure I knew who I was, but after being in a setting where I was not one of many, I felt the need to kind of to go to a setting where I was now surrounded by, and I could build a network of other students of color. And I had never been in a school setting in that regard. So I decided to go to Lincoln. And at Lincoln, I was engaged. I wasn't as engaged as I think I could have been now when I look back on it. And it's so true. They always tell you, and my family mentioned to me, when you go away to school, don't have a boyfriend. And I think I didn't take heed to it then. And I had a long-term relationship in college. So I probably didn't get as involved as I would have been had I not been involved in that relationship. But the one thing that I did do is on campus, I did engage in the debate club as well as some civic opportunities of community service on campus. And those couple of things, or just being engaged in that regard, really honed my love for community service. And that was how I knew I had this passion. And when I graduated, I wanted to do something to serve. Before education, right after undergrad, I spent some time being a community organizer for a low-income housing project in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And there I was a social service coordinator. But being that social service coordinator, you can't provide services if you don't know people. And so I made sure that I got to know the residents, but in getting to know the residents, I needed to know what were their needs and how could I aid in helping to build that community. And so I was really proud of a lot of the work that we did there, from making sure that we engaged everyone from 0 to 99. So we had a senior population that was really engaged while I was there. Then we had anything from Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, who were our younger population of students that we engaged. So I would say that was kind of who I was in undergrad, moving into right after undergrad, just someone that was civically involved and engaged. And I think that has been carried with me throughout even my professional career over the last several years as well.
And then you went on to St. Peter's for which is another private institution. As you know, Bloomfield is a part of the private institutional network here in New Jersey. What made you decide on St. Peter's?
I actually started at St. Peter's because I was in the teacher alternate route program. Mm-hmm. Because as I just mentioned, I was a social service coordinator. So I did not enter education through a very traditional means. After being a social service coordinator at a low-income housing project, I began to kind of look at the effects of poverty and not having education were having on many young women that I encountered. I was probably about 22, I would say. And sometimes I would enter into apartments of residents who were my age, who, for whatever means, didn't and hadn't received an education. And so it really got me to thinking, if we're going to change the paradigm, I need to be engaged on the ground to make sure that young women, young men in our communities especially understand the value of education and what education gives you in terms of access. I'm a first generation college student, but there was someone always in my ear that, this is your means of making it, right? If you go to school, you do what you need to do, you get an education. And sometimes that gets lost, and it gets lost because it's not started early enough. And so I said, you know what, how could I start this conversation earlier? And I decided I'm going to take the praxis exam. Let's see what happens. Took the praxis, passed it, but because I was not a traditional education major, I needed to go through alternate route. While I was there for the alternate route program, I said, okay, and I gravitated and was at a school that really cultivated who I was, I think, as an educational professional. And so then the next step was, wow, I can go ahead and I can get my master's while I'm here as well. So let's go ahead and do that. And that's what I did. And this is how I moved into education, or that is how I moved into education.
And then just a little bit more just about your college and graduate experience. Obviously, AKA, was that an undergrad or graduate chapter?
I did a grad chapter. So I was in the process of pledging an undergrad. But for my undergrad experience, they were suspended. I won't say why. but we were suspended on campus. So I didn't have an opportunity to pledge in undergrad, but I always knew that I wanted to pledge, always knew that I wanted to be an AKA. There was never a question. I have an
Mhm.
older cousin who is an AKA, and she was my first the first person that I really encountered that I got to share their college journey with.
Right.
And she is 13 or 15 years older than I am. So when I was about 4, she was away in undergrad. And she would come home, and when she pledged, she came home with her jacket and she would say, "You're going to say ski." And so, and I'm like 4 years old throwing up my pinky. But that kind of mentorship is like what I would like to call it. It's not a formalized process of mentorship, but that kind of mentorship is what winded up really instilling in me that I was going to be an AKA. And it was just this little thing planted in the back of my head. But when I got on Lincoln's campus, it was no doubt that I was going to be an AKA. Unfortunately, like I said, they were suspended, so I didn't have the opportunity to pledge undergrad, but I pledged grad, and I pledged in my 20s in the grad chapter
And
here in Newark, New Jersey.
as a professional woman, how has being a part of the AKA Sorority Incorporated organization been instrumental in your life?
It's a network of sisterhood,
Hmm.
but I think when you look at sororities and fraternities and you look at HBCUs, you understand the obligation that you have.
Okay.
So as a professional woman, AKA has definitely been great in terms of having a automatic sisterhood of folks that I can call on. But it also reminds me from a perspective of scholarship what I owe to people, not
Mm.
just what you can get, but what is your obligation. To whom much is given, much is required. And I think that that is one thing that both AKA and my educational sorority that I'm a professional sorority that I'm a member of, which is Phi Delta Kappa, they both do a lot of service work in the community, and I must admit with both of them over the last couple of years, I haven't been as active or as engaged as I would like to be, just because being a wife and motherhood, I have an 11-month-old son. So this is very new to me, and I'm still finding my way of how to maintain my former levels of engagement and involvement, and not taking my son all around the world, but making sure that I continue to remain engaged.
Which is actually a great transition to. I wanted you to speak a little bit before we really dug into today's topic, but I think it's important to humanize our leaders, as well as, again, I continue to say it's important for Bloomfield College students to see us, to see people like us who come from our communities, who go through the same things, who have some of the same experiences, who get sold some of the same antidotes and sort of advisements that your grandmother and mom have passed down to you, and yet you still, find ways to make your own decisions, become into your own, and able to become successful, regardless of sort of the stereotypes, as we always say, which I think plays a barrier as well. Just the stereotypes alone can be a hindrance to folks to push forward. How are you doing as first a new wife, a new mom, and then as a principal? Tell us a little bit about your those three roles.
So I'm going to start with my first role, not my first role in terms of priority, but the first role that I had. So
Okay.
the first role that I had before I became a wife, before I became a mom, was that of being my school's principal. And I can tell you, something that I haven't been good at, just being very transparent, has been probably time management. I haven't always worked as smart. I always work hard, but not necessarily smart. I would leave my building sometimes at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, just because I wanted to make sure that things got done. And it came to a point probably because it's very stressful being a principal, but the reward of knowing that you're investing in someone is also great. So it's worth the stress, right? Because nothing in life is always going to be easy. But there came a point, probably about 2 years ago, that I began to suffer with really bad vertigo. And I couldn't understand what was happening. I would literally come into work and lay on the floor in my office because it had gotten so bad. And what I realized was, just because I started going to a holistic chiropractor, is that it was stress. And it was stress of managing the day to day. And then we were also having some challenges as a school, not academically at all, but we are also a unionized charter school, which we weren't prior to myself taking over. And we're a tier 1 charter school, which we weren't before I took over. So, like, there were these little microaggressions that a lot of times confront women of color that I was dealing with. And I didn't realize it, but it was exhibiting itself through the stress and through my health. So I would say that being a principal is definitely a challenging role, but if you believe in our communities, if you believe in our children, and if most importantly, if you believe that our children deserve access, you're going to take on that burden, right? You'll figure out how to manage it. So I think lately, now that moving into becoming a wife and a mom, I've had to learn to work a little bit smarter. And I wasn't always good at delegating responsibilities. I think I would just say, oh, I'm going to do it. Now I'm still not great at it, but I'm trying to begin to learn how to delegate responsibilities to other folks, and then give myself the heavy lifts, but the heavy lifts that are working smart, not necessarily just working hard. It's going to be hard work regardless what you do, if you ever want to give 110, 150% of something, but there are ways to work smarter than what I had in the past. So all three of those, and becoming a wife and a mom, in adding those two roles to already the role of being the principal, has made me change how I approach the work that I do. But you see, I'm here in my office, and schools are closed, but we're still serving lunch. So I'm here 2 days a week at our school. And thank God I have a very supportive husband who is also willing and picking up some of those responsibilities that concern our son. But, oftentimes my son, prior to COVID, believe it or not, my son unfortunately knows our school already. He knows the office, and the kids know him because he's been here at Saturday Academy with me. You figure it out and you make a way. And I want to instill that in my son very early on, that yes, there may be challenges that present themselves, but you will make a way, and you will figure out how to get the job done.
So how many students are in your particular school?
Our school is really almost like a small independent school. We have 324 students,
Mm-hmm.
but we just were granted approval, and we will be expanding to be 460 students because we're opening a high school. Our high school opens next year. So we will have a K-12 trajectory. When I got here, we were only 252 students, and then I expanded by 72. We expanded our lower grades, and we moved to 324, and now we'll be at, I think, about 460 or 480.
For those who may be thinking, and then we'll get into the topic a little more. Well, this is someone who's the principal of a charter school. And yes, she's talking about the equity and the importance of equity in our school system. Tell us, clarify that perception that some people may have, and then tell us why you feel it's important.
Okay. So let me backtrack a little bit, if you don't mind. I didn't just come and become the principal here of Queen City Academy Charter School, right? Which is a charter school in Plainfield. Prior to that, I taught in Newark Public Schools for 8 years at Burnett Street School, which is now closed, but it was a school in the district's North Ward. And then right after Burnett, I was a curriculum specialist for very rural, Brunswick County, North Carolina. That is between Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a beach community, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. There's one entrance into the entire area, which is Route 17. And it's made up of, it's a county-wide school district, but it's made up of multiple towns and municipalities in this one county of Brunswick County. So I feel that from having been exposed to urban America in a traditional public school setting, then rural America and a traditional public school setting, and now being at a charter school, I have been very well positioned to see what it's like and when we have practices that don't provide equity for students. And then what is it that we need to change so that we do begin to have more equitable practices for scholars? And I think that that's a conversation that people often shy away from. Sometimes they'll say, oh, well, just let's make sure that they have equality. No, no, no. We can't have equality because there are these things in America, unfortunately, that are systemic issues that haven't changed over that last 100 years. And so in order to deal with those issues and begin to make sure that all students are successful, we have to make sure that we talk about equity and not talk about just equality, because those systems that are in place make it very hard for one set of students to have the same equality that you're trying to speak of that another group may have. And so that's why the conversation has to be wrapped around how do we make this practice more equitable so that student A may enter the door with this and student B may enter the door with this. But when they both leave, we make sure that they are prepared. And you can't do that if you just talk about equality. That means you have to talk about equity.
So when we talk about equity, what role do you feel, well, first of all, what's your perspective on, in terms of the governance structure, the current governing structures we have, whether it's at the local level, state level, or federal, and how does that impact equity versus equality?
Well, you know, I think the one great thing that's happening here in New Jersey on our state level is that the current commissioner, Commissioner Repoulet, really took that charge of making sure when he came into office, the conversation of equity even began to happen. And it was put at the forefront. So I think from a state level perspective, now that we are at least poised to start having the conversation, that means that we are poised to change some of the practices that exist that don't provide for equity. I think from some local levels, in terms of the way that governance happens, there's a way that it on paper that it should happen oftentimes, but that doesn't always equate to how it actually happens. Things often become very top down, and a top down approach where the people who it affect don't really have a say so in what happens. Well, really, and they have a lot of power, but unfortunately, sometimes in our current communities, the people that we're servicing don't get as engaged as it involved, but it's because I don't think they've been invited the right way to be engaged and involved. We make it very cumbersome instead of making it easy as to how to engage our parents, how to engage our families, how to engage the community so that they have a greater voice in what happens and it not be a very top-down structure of a district saying, this is what we need before we have really heard the input from the families, the teachers, and the whole community around them saying, this is what we need. So I think a great example of that is, it's a cartoon, and it's like it's a comic strip someone had written before,
Mhm.
and the district says we need a swing, but the teacher then says, okay, let's put a tire with a string hanging on a tree, and that can be the swing. But when the kid designed the swing, the kid says, no, that's not the swing that I need. I need a swing that I can actually sit on, that will work with me, that I can utilize. And I think oftentimes, sometimes we miss the mark because we haven't just gone to the population that we serve and say, what is it that you need? We have a curriculum that we rolled out last year. And, you know, as a team, the administrative approach and our leadership team, we're thinking about, oh, letting our children study the classics, and this is what they should read. Well, when we took it to the voice and to the kids, their approach of what they needed was very different, right? And they selected one of the texts they selected was The Hate U Give. And so I think that's a prime example of, if you take it to them, we don't often value their thoughts, their opinions. And I think that goes for children, that goes for parents. We oftentimes don't listen enough to value those opinions. And when we do, though, I think our results are usually so very different, because our curriculum, when we decided to start listening to the kids and figuring out what they needed, we saw drastic gains where we had been stagnant for a few years, and hadn't really seen growth more than 3 percentage points. And one year we saw a growth 6 percentage points and more. So I think it really has to do with listening and making sure that we're listening.
So the next question I have, and some of it you kind of touched on, but if we could dig a little deeper, in terms of, for the barriers we have, um, for those who want to be a part of that change, for those who didn't get the invite, and then touch on whose responsibility is it to invite us, the us. But outside of that, for those who want to be a part of that change, what can they do, and how should they go about removing or overcoming some of the barriers that you are aware of and have mentioned?
The first thing is, I think you need to come out and be involved, be engaged, right? So everything from that report card night to that board meeting to the school is having some kind of activity. Many of our families are faced with working multiple jobs. So maybe you can't come to everything, but identify something and make it a priority for you to get there. Because once you get there and people know that you are going to be there, they're going to interact with you differently as well, because they then might say, hey, you know what, let's solicit Miss Jones's advice around this issue. We know that she's come out, we know that she's had some experience with this. It's about building that relationship. But if the school is not inviting you in, I definitely think making sure that you're present at the Board of Education meetings, because those are public meetings, making sure that you're really there, you're voicing your concerns and that they hear you, as well as, if you can't go attend a meeting and voice your concern, write a letter. But just picking up the phone, I know for myself, I have a pretty open door policy. We're a much smaller school district, so I'm able to do that, where I can just listen to my parents. They know that they can pick up the phone, they can call me. It has gotten a little different over the years, where I probably haven't been as accessible in the last few years as we've been gearing up to grow our high school, but they know they can always shoot me an email and I'm going to respond back. I think those lines of communication have to be open, and someone has to be the point person in a district to make sure that happens. Coming from a much larger district, or much larger districts before I got here, there's always a point person that you can contact for Board of Education meetings, whether you want to speak at a meeting or just go to the meeting and be engaged, be involved, listen, speak to your actual school's principal, tell them what your concerns are and let them begin to advocate for you and build that relationship. Because any principal, I would say, that really is about the business and making sure that kids succeed and learn. If a parent comes with a valid question, concern, they're going to figure out, well, how do we put our heads together and how do we address this? How do I make sure that my parents understand that this was my thought process, but maybe my thought process wasn't right. So let me hear your thought process, and let's meet in the middle somewhere. Let's figure out what we can do differently together. For example, I never forget, not a couple of years ago, my parents were in an uproar because we had implemented silent lunch. I went to visit a great school who they perform great in terms of their test scores. And so I was like, oh, well, let us try this. And my parents went berserk. So it didn't last too long. But once we sat down and I heard their concerns, we came to a common medium, right? And we figured out, well, how do we structure lunch differently? And then it even was a learning experience for me, because as I began to look at it and I thought hard about it myself, I said, wait a minute. I didn't grow up in school in a silent cafeteria where there was no conversation. How will my kids learn to communicate and go out and have a business lunch? How will they learn to interact with people over food if I don't begin to teach that here with them? And we can't do that just sitting in a cafeteria being quiet. But I hadn't really examined those ends of that puzzle. And I also think I didn't have the same kind of heart around that issue because I hadn't been a parent yet. And now I look at things like, what would I want for my son? And I always used to ask that question, but I think now it hits home differently now that I am a parent. And I'm like, wait a minute. When I think back about that now, I think like I was really crazy. I missed the mark. How could I sit and expect kids? I'm an adult. I don't sit and have a quiet lunch if I'm sitting across the table with someone. I have conversation. Why should it be any different for a student? And I think that that's what often gets missed, is the opportunity for parents and the school to collaborate. And those lines of communication don't happen as freely as they could when folks, and I might get in trouble that I say this, but I'm going to say it, when folks that sit in the seat don't have the heart and service of our kids.
Mm-hmm. I think we talk about that at the collegiate level too, how important that is. Even though you're dealing with an older population and adults, that in terms of a role of a student, from their perspective, there is, regardless of age, there's still a necessity for leadership. And when you look to your folks who are in leadership roles, if they do not exemplify someone who cares about students, it does affect you as a person, or as the person that's expecting the service regardless. And so I think it's so important that we do have people who are in positions that actually have not only the credentials, but have the compassion and uh, the passion for students. With that being said, you talk a lot about something that I'm really interested in and engaged in, which is parent engagement. And I also want to talk about community engagement and why true community partnerships and parent partnerships are important to the success of our school systems, our respective schools, and our individual students. In terms of, because there's a different challenge. We've been talking about equity versus equality for generations. And I don't want to suggest that each generation has not played a part in moving the ball down the field, but for people of color, which is typically what equity and inequality is often discussed, the finish line continues to get moved. So in terms of generational strategies, what charges do you put to the parents of today, the students of today, in terms of what their charges and focuses should be, not perhaps from just your personal perspective, but from based on your professional experience?
Well, we have a established parent advisory council here at our school.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we've always tried to do is, and our turnout hasn't been great, hasn't always been the way that we would like it to be. But one of the things I always try to tell the council when we put together activities for our parents is, let's meet the parents where they are. right? So if that means we're moving a meeting to a Saturday, it means we're moving a meeting to a Saturday. But if it means that we know that parents need jobs and they don't have viable employment, then that means we need to think about what are some opportunities to provide for them job training or put information in front of them that will help to create generational success. Back in, I think, 2015, 2014, we hosted an American Dream Day here at our school. That American Dream Day had mortgage brokers, realtors, job opportunities. It was like a big fair. And it was for our parent community and the larger community. And the goal of that was to really help our parents and the greater community think about generational success. We had credit repair folks here because we know that oftentimes in our communities and with people of color, because we have, unfortunately, we're starting behind the eight ball because of systemic racism and all of the barriers that we face. It is always where we need to extend that hand so that we begin to equip them with those things that will empower them to move forward, and not just as an individual, but as a family to move forward, right? How do we make sure that families understand that the American dream of home ownership, and then when your kids get ready to go to college and you have equity in your home, you have something to borrow against to put your child through college. All of those conversations, because we don't really have real conversations about money either in our communities, unfortunately, are conversations that from a school perspective and engaging our parents, that's what's needed in order to set our families up for success later on. So it's twofold, right? It's one, making sure that we educate the kid that is sitting in the seat in front of us, and making sure that we provide them that access to college and then provide them the resources to get through college, because we're talking about two different things. We can take you to the door, but now how are we going to make sure that we empower you to stay and you understand what's happening so that you successfully graduate? Right. And then that you do so wisely without being straddled down with debt that is more than a mortgage when you get ready to leave school, right? Because so many of our students, unfortunately, they leave school and they're straddled down with debt that doesn't allow them to get ahead as faster and come out and then maybe make different choices because you're worried about taking a job just to pay back bills instead of taking a job or an opportunity that may present itself. And the opportunity may not always pay a lot, but you may know the opportunity will excel you 10 steps ahead where you would have gone or where you would have been had you not taken that opportunity. We don't oftentimes have that luxury because we don't have a safety net to fall back on. And then on top of that, we have these bills that we're straddled down with from student loan debt. So I think it's helping our kids get to and through college and do so smartly and wisely by making sure they don't accumulate a lot of debt. But then it's also helping the family to understand from an economic perspective how they can begin to make progress generationally and what will last. You know, we don't oftentimes in our communities set up for for the rainy day and, you know, think about how do we invest? How do we have multiple streams of income? All of those are conversations that I don't care just because you're a school building and you're there to educate, but those are conversations that you should be having because that's part of education. It may not be educating just that scholar that's in front of you, but guess what? When you educate a family, you in turn are helping to provide the network that student sitting in your seat will need from family to be successful. So I don't think you can do just one and not think about the impact that you need to have from a family perspective in preparing our families to be able to deal with and build generational success and wealth. I think you have to do it in tandem.
A question from one of our participants, Meredith, and I'll add a little bit to it, but is that one of your biggest barriers you run into as a young Black leader of a school? Or, and if not, what is?
Um, you know, I think the biggest barrier that I have ran into,
Mm-hmm.
that I am much more in tune with now, um, are these microaggressions that people, can say they don't exist, but sexism is real and racism is real. And as a woman of color, I deal with both. And I oftentimes have to think very strategically before I even roll something out or before I even ask a question. There were times that I wouldn't ask a question. I would ask our assistant director, who was a man, to ask the question. Or if I knew that I was going to be dealing with an issue wrapped around race, which can be hard and sensitive, I would think of a backdoor approach of how do I confront this? How do I deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
And it can't come from me, even though I was the person driving the bus. I would have someone else in place, whether they were a consultant, whether it was another staff member who could approach and deal with those issues if it was wrapped around sexism or racism, because I knew the sensitivity that therein lies, and sometimes I didn't want to deal with a headbutt and have friction. But now I am, and I think part of that also was my own naivety, my own just being naive. I didn't realize the power of confronting an issue, but I still
Mm-hmm.
feel like I have to be very strategic and very wise about how you confront those issues wrapped around sexism and racism, because they're real. People are sensitive about them, but you don't get anywhere if you don't deal with them.
We call it giving it a name. We say if we don't give it a name, we can't address it, right? And
Mhm.
so you talked about doing it with obviously grace and professionalism. And even that is a different standard perhaps for people of color. So for those that are in the audience saying, I can identify with what she's talking about, um, that not necessarily if it's sexism or racism, but just an ism at all,
Mhm.
that the feeling that you described of being inside of that frustrating place, um, what do you see you, I always say I put my principles before my personality. A lot of times when I am in those type of situations, what is it for you, and what advice would you give folks who are in any type of situation? So whether it's about fighting for equity, fighting for equality, fighting for your school, um, um, school rights or school systems. But it sounds like some of what you're suggesting is also transferable in terms of other areas of work or even life where you may be confronted with those same type of frustrations. What do you actually draw from? How do you deal with that? How did you become um, as graceful or as professional as you may be at this point?
I wasn't always.
Right.
I would just really, you know, because I function from a place of passion. So I
Hmm.
often would very passionately call it out, say it, and then I realized that I often it would create this friction. So I started kind of just analyzing and sitting back and taking stock of, what's my big end goal? And if this is my big end goal, how do I get there? And
Right.
I'll begin to kind of just map things out, and weigh the pros and cons, and then think about how do I reach that same end goal, but without maybe being as confrontational, or because it's not that I would be being confrontational, because it really is just calling out what it is. But I always had to sit and think, okay, I know how it looks for me and what it is for me, but how will that other person perceive it? And if I felt the other person's perception of it was going to be something that was
Hmm.
going to cause more friction than the issue was really worth, and derail us from that real big end goal, then I had to ask myself, is it really worth it? So I
Hmm.
then would say, how could I still accomplish that end goal, backdoor and deal with this other ism and this issue that's happening here, but doing it in a way that won't cause as much friction. And so that even then later on, the person or the people that were involved in whatever the case, the situation was, they would be self-reflective and begin to think on their own, like, like maybe, maybe this is an opportunity for me to grow too, right? Because it's about building, building folks, because we all walk in a space with some kind of bias, right? And because we walk in with who we are and what our value system is, so we all walk into a space with something. My something may not be your something, and I think we have to get to a place of understanding and valuing that we all walk into this space with something. Now, moving forward, how do we deal with it? And then how do we deal with it that's going to be in the best interest of students? Because that's my ultimately big end goal, is making sure that everything we do is student-centered and in the best interest of students. And then as a leader, yes, I'm going to be faced with some challenges, and I'm going to have some things that I have to deal with, but how can I deal with it? And how can I build a network to help me to deal with it? So that it's not always just me functioning in a silo of figuring something out.
If you have to go through that process, I'm wondering how students and their parents are impacted. And so then that goes to another question that was provided by someone as anonymous. But why do you believe that some parents are not as involved in their children's education? How does that affect you as a leader and in your efforts of trying to change sort of that community and your community?
I think innately, most parents, if not all, want to be involved and engaged. I think you then have to look at what the realities of a situation are and assess maybe why they are not as engaged and as involved. For example, if I am a single mom and I'm working 2 jobs or maybe just 1 job, so then I have to come home, I have to prepare dinner, I have to make sure that, my son or my daughter is ready for the next day. And maybe I have my own mental and emotional baggage I'm dealing with, that I'm not as engaged as I want to be. So I think it is one, really making sure that first we kind of assess the situations and don't just paint a wide stroke brush and say, oh, they just don't want to be engaged because, they'll do everything else, but they just won't come to school. That's not everybody's case all the time. And I'm finding more and more that by large majority, that is not most folks' case. It is the burdens of life are heavy at times. And I think you have to be sympathetic to those burdens. And then you have to figure out, okay, where is their starting point? How can I get them engaged?
So another question that I wanted to go to another question from the audience, because you've shared a lot of jewels, and there has to be some folks who inspire you, some folks who've kind of been like a mentor. Who are some of the people in terms of education and in this fight for equity and equality for our school systems that perhaps you look up to, you call on for advice, you send an email or text to?
So I have a couple of people. But I would say in terms of the space of education, who has had the most profound impact on me, and really taught me from a leadership perspective how to run a building and how to run a building and an organization that was geared towards students, has been Kathy Duke Jackson. She was my principal in Newark Public Schools. At the time, she was about the age, when she was my principal, she was about the age that I am now. And she never accepted anything less than our best. And at the time, there would be often days, to be quite honest with you, I might sit in my classroom and cry, because I would say, wow, I was one of those teachers that I just wanted to do right, because I have such a love for the residents in the city of Newark, for the students that I was serving. So I wanted to get it right. I didn't want to miss the mark. And every time the bar she set the bar here. Then once you reach that bar, she raised the bar a little bit. And then she kept raising it a little bit more. And she is now an assistant superintendent in the city, in Newark Public Schools. But she really instilled in me how to keep raising the bar and raising the mark for myself, as well as for those teachers that I lead. I would watch her dedication and her commitment. Often walking out of a building at 10 o'clock at night, she put that into our school. And that was one of the first professional teams of colleagues that I worked with that continued to raise the bar for themselves. And because of that, we were originally back in, I guess, the early 2000s, the state had a process of ranking schools, and Kappa was a Kappa team. We were originally a low performing school, but we were the team that moved Burnett Street School from being low performing to moving it out of Kappa and not being on the low performing list anymore, which was a huge feat. But I look at, and I often think back to what it was and how she approached some situations. And I must say that I think in my own leadership, I've picked up a lot of those jewels and tried to approach educating students in that same vein.
How would you say that that is a strategy that we all should take? Identify, connecting to, what would you call it, connecting to mentors like that as a form, as a part of the strategy for us to access power and resources? And what else would you say, or what else would you advise of? How do we do that? How do we access the power to be able to influence and make these changes? And how do we influence how those resources come into our community, and so that we can balance the scales as it relates to equity and equality?
I think from if I were in college, the one thing I would say to make sure that you are engaged, right? And making sure you identify mentorship in various areas of your life, because you may have a mentor that is your professional mentor, but then you may have someone in terms of your personal life that you have and you can go to for counsel. So I would think that, or from a collegiate, if I were in college, that those would be some of the steps I would take in terms of identifying mentorship. As a professional now in identifying mentorship, I continue to hone my craft by reading, attending webinars myself, conferences, and making sure that I am doing so from a very diverse perspective. So that means that all of my mentors and all of my network doesn't look like me, right? That means that there are other folks that I have to surround myself with so that I have diversity in thought. And I can understand how one person may think about a situation versus someone else, because again, we all come to this space with different biases and come from different cultures and different communities.
Right.
And so in order to be able to make a very global assessment of something, I think you have to have your ear and your eyes paying attention to everyone and having that diversity of thought around a particular situation or issue that you may be dealing with. And I think that diversity around the table also ensures that you don't miss some pieces. But I don't want to also miss the mark of making sure that as a woman of color, that I empower other women of color. And from an organizational perspective, our school, we have a diversity charge and we have a diversity plan. And I always try to make sure that when we are looking for vendors, when we are looking to engage various vendors, that there is representation from diverse and underserved, or not underserved, but represented communities that oftentimes don't get a seat at the table for vendors. I'll never forget, a few years ago, we were doing a custodial bid, and the threshold for the contract and previous contracts, it was something that may be out of reach for a minority owned business, or business that just, maybe just getting its start, or so I went to our council and I said, how can we make this more inclusive, so that folks who typically may not be in this arena have an opportunity to sit at the table and play as well, right? And so our council, we worked on, how do we still have an insurance threshold that will satisfy our legal requirements, but how do we make it more inclusive to have more women and minorities apply and be a part of this bid perspective? And so I think that being very intentional is how you make that happen, because that doesn't happen through osmosis, right? It doesn't happen from someone just saying, oh, you know what, we're going to go out to bid and we're going to just see what comes back. No, it's about being intentional from the inception to say, we need to craft these bid specs a little differently, because we want it to be more open and inclusive to women and minorities to apply, who normally don't get a chance and an opportunity to apply on public works bids, because the insurance threshold is out of their reach. The number of jobs that they've done in the past that's over X amount of dollars is out of their reach. And that leaves things to being a very closed network, and it's the same people playing in that network. So how do we open that network up? And so as long as I sit here, or as long as I sit in any organization, I'm always going to want to make sure, I'm always going to make sure that I require the organization to give everyone a seat at the table, especially women and minorities, because systematically we've been cut out and we haven't always had a seat at the table.
I was going to comment on I wanted to talk about like get your feedback on like training of staff and individuals who are in position to train to make these decisions. Sometimes people make decisions based on who they are and what their experience is, not necessarily the needs of the people they're in position to serve, if that makes sense. What would be your perspective on, there's been a lot of conversation, things in different research documents about the community model for schools, and based on the areas and the communities we come from, our students, our parents also need certain resources that many of our schools in our community do not offer. What's your thoughts on that?
I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think that goes back to the beginning of our conversation when I talked about the school being able to be a beacon for the community, and it being a place that really mobilizes the community. In order to make that happen, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. You have to make sure that the people that sit in the seats that make those decisions really have our community and our kids at heart. Because if you don't have both of those at heart, this for you will be, let me go in, let me do my job, let me get it done. But you are not going to make that effort to figure out, well, what is it that these students need? What is it that the parents need from a community perspective, an individual perspective? Because you are not concerned about the community. You are not concerned about the individual that sits there. You're concerned about doing your job, right? And so a job is very different than a passion. And I will say, I think until the day I die, you can't be an effective educator if you don't have a passion and a love for the people that you serve. You just can't, right? It's no way humanly possible. You may cross all the, check off all the boxes. Your grades may be submitted on time. You might give the assessments that you need to give. Yes,
Yeah.
but that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, and the real part of the equation, is the heart that you do something with, and having that passion and having that drive to make sure that no matter what happens, you're going to stay the course. Because oftentimes what I find is when you don't have that passion, you don't have that heart, it's harder for you to stay the course.
Two more points I want you to touch on, and then we'll sort of transition to close out. But what are your thoughts on current or needed assessments as it relates to interventions that are relevant to professional development for educators, and then also for the assessments of our students, not just proficiency, but their growth overall?
I think from an educator perspective, I think if nothing else, this pandemic that we are experiencing right now
Mm-hmm.
has highlighted the need for technology. I know from just for my own personal experience in transitioning from a brick to mortar building to being virtual, I don't think we have been as proficient as we should be. Even though the technology standards have been written for years and they're built into our curriculums, we are not as proficient with utilizing the technology the way that we should, so that we are truly exposing our kids and then preparing our kids for competition in a real global society. I think the lack of access that our kids have was put
Mm-hmm.
on full display, from families at home in homes without internet access to lack of devices. And then I think for the teaching perspective, it was put on full display that many teachers weren't proficient about how do I move from having a student take an assessment in paper and pen fashion to now doing something more virtual, and that when they're not
Mm-hmm.
sitting in front of me, but I can still keep them engaged. And you would think that in the 21st century we would have had that down pat, but we haven't. As educators, we missed the mark. And so I think now is a time, though, that it's an opportunity, because now we know where we missed the mark, so it's an opportunity to build from there. I remember we closed, I think it was March 16th and 17th, or 17th and 18th. It was a
Mm-hmm.
Monday and a Tuesday. We closed to begin to prepare for sending home information and packets, because we knew that a closure for some time, at least 2 weeks, is what we initially thought would be taking place. And I came in our building and I see parents coming to pick up packets. And I'm like, there's a lot of packets moving around. What's happening? So I said, but wait a minute. If we're going to be able to satisfy the requirement of 180 days and teach new concepts and skills, a packet can't be leaving out of this building. We need to be thinking about how do we keep parents and students engaged and
Mm-hmm.
involved in real time? And
Mm-hmm.
how do we address and answer their questions? So I said, stop everything we're doing. We're going to meet with teachers. We're going to put together a PD real quick, and we're going to talk about how do we go virtual. And that's just what we did. And we moved from all these packets flying all around to getting people up and on Google Classroom. Granted, then we realized we didn't have a lot of participation at first. So I'm like, let's find out why we don't have participation. We know from our parent survey, just only about 20 to 30% of our population did not have access. So let's find out what's going on. When we began
Mm-hmm.
to make phone calls to parents, we were finding out that some parents only had a phone they were trying to allow their kid to do work through, right? We found out some parents were working at night. So how do we deal with this? What do we need to do differently? So we decided we need to make sure that those kids that don't have Chromebooks, we have a distribution day that we can give out Chromebooks. Those kids that don't have internet access, we're going to buy hotspots, and we're going to make sure that every family has a hotspot so that they have access if they don't have access. So those were some of the very practical things we did. But then we needed to talk about, okay, well, what is the dynamic looking like at home? If we made sure they have a device, but the kid is still not able to get online, and their assignments aren't being turned in on time, do we need to move and change our scheduling? Maybe we shouldn't be giving work every day. Maybe it should be an A-B day. So if somebody's working at night and they come home and during the day, they can work during the day. If they work during the day and they have to make sure that the kid is submitting assignments during the evening, they have an opportunity. So it was looking at the full picture and
Mm-hmm.
looking from a very holistic point of view. How do we help and make sure that our families, now that they have this access, because that was the first thing, is making sure that they have access through a device and the internet. But now, how do we help them manage a schedule that's doable? How do we make sure that we are not just piling on stuff for the sake of piling it on and saying we're satisfying 180 days of work, but we're not making sure that is something, especially in a time where families are going through trauma, just as kids are going through trauma, right? We have to think, like, we don't know if they lost a loved one the day before, if they have a family member that's in the hospital and they can't see them. We don't know what's happening socially and emotionally. So that leads me to my next point of view, that I think many schools that we have to pick up the charge is addressing the social and emotional needs much more than we currently do of our scholars. And so thinking about that, and that's why one of the reasons we're not a no excuses charter school,
Mm-hmm.
because I believe that it's very important that we honor a student from a very holistic perspective. So that means making sure that we have social engagement for them. We have mentorship
Absolutely.
programs. We have
Mm-hmm.
dances, all of those rites of passage
Mm-hmm.
that happen in other communities. Why shouldn't they happen in our community? Why aren't our kids exposed to that? Why don't we have, different activities and after school clubs and all of those things, but making sure that those are present just as much as we stress the academic component.
I, I like that. First of all, I don't expect anything less, but it's just impressive that your style of leadership with each response is example about with having researched it or having done it, having tried it. And everything is linked to measure, every action is linked to a measurable result. How can we see the work we're doing? And so a final question just wrapped around this issue is, how is data and also reporting data, and we hear speculations and conspiracies around that in regards to our or our students in our community, how is that important, reporting that accurately, important to equity?
I think the data tells a story, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
in order for your staff, in order for the community at large to see the
Mm-hmm.
need for things, they have to see the data as to why this is one inequitable right now, and then how do we change it so that it is more equitable. And
Yes.
without the data, sometimes we often work off of our hunches, how we feel about something, right? And so I think, like, even when we go back, that story I told you about our leadership team and selecting the text that kids were going to read and taking it to the kids and letting them decide. So as the adults, we were sitting in a room thinking one thing. When we took it to our kids, they thought something completely different. That's the data that tells us that story, right? So if we look at what our socioeconomic data tells us around our families, and then we do surveys and we have where our families report back, that tells us the story. And
Mm-hmm.
then from that, we're able to inform what our practice should look like or needs to look like, and if we need to change something.
As some final comments in regards to COVID-19, um, graduating seniors, in terms of your district, or not even seniors, just graduate programs, whether it's from elementary school, transition programs. How are you guys dealing with that and supporting graduates this year? And then, what are your thoughts on colleges and universities pushing absentee ballot education and awareness on campus?
I think, well, before this, because I am speaking to a college audience right now, I want to say, for if there are any graduating seniors on this call or on this webinar, the time is now, and it is your time. And to really internalize that. this time more than ever now is for you to explore opportunities and options and think outside of the box. Too often we think in the box. And that goes back to what I said. Sometimes we're not afforded the opportunity of saying, hey, I want to take opportunity B here, which might be to go work in Europe for a year because I think I can't afford it. And so because I didn't take that opportunity, it doesn't set me up or set me in place for the next opportunity. Whether it is, maybe it is even, I want to go work on a presidential campaign, but I can't afford it. It would be unpaid, or it would, it would be, it's not enough to sustain and support me.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a will, there's a way. This is your time to really explore all of those opportunities, because the dividends may not come right now, but you would be setting yourself up for later on in life. And so I
Right.
think really understanding that, I would want any graduating senior to really, whether you are graduating from high school, whether you're graduating from 8th grade, whether you're graduating from college, but probably more so the college graduate in terms of the economic perspective. But the high school and the 8th grade graduate, they need to understand that their time is now as well, right? And so it's their time to set up themselves for success. And I think from an organizational perspective, it is our obligation and to make sure that those rites of passage ceremonies, they don't get lost in the sauce because of COVID-19. So whether or not it is delayed, that's fine, right? It may not be at the time that we wanted it to be, but we must figure out a way to celebrate our graduates and our at this time during COVID-19, and not let the pandemic set the course that we miss some of those celebratory things. It might be a different kind of celebration, but I think we still need to make sure that we honor and celebrate those students for their accomplishment at this milestone in their life. But I think around that celebration, we really need to talk about grit and resilience, because despite this pandemic that we're experiencing right now, it's an opportunity. Instead of looking at it with the glass half empty, it's an opportunity to look at it as the glass half full and figure out how resilient can you be in the midst of this, and how can you elevate yourself to that next level. What is it that you can do a little differently because of this? How has it affected you to look at things differently, and how has it affected others to look at things differently? And then start thinking about, it's affected me in this way. It's affected Sue over here this way. Let me begin to think about what might be something that I can do that will impact both Sue and I. And those ideas that you generate, flush them out, give them some real thought, and then identify what can you do moving forward to take that idea to the next level. Because they say, I think I was watching a webinar, I can't remember what it was on, but it was talking about COVID, and during that conversation, they were talking about the last recession. And the last recession that we were in, how many businesses were birthed out of that. And I think that this is an opportunity for especially college graduates, seniors this year, to think about what opportunities are they able to think about and birth out of the current circumstances that we're in.
Danielle West, the importance of equity in our school system, the year of the census, again, the year of the vote. Any final thoughts?
Make sure you fill out your census, especially for our communities. I got a call the other day. Newark sent out their robocall for the census. And I think we were just at about 20 or 30% of our population having taken it. And that's unacceptable, right? Because the resources that come along with making sure community has taken and the residents have participated in the census are
Hmm.
invaluable. And, it's the same thing with our vote. In 2016, I think um, we were dealing with we were dealing with some isms, right? I think we were dealing with sexism, to be quite honest. It was on full display in 2016. And I think because of that, we became apathetic as a block of people to go out and vote.
Right.
And we are in a situation now where there have been many things that affect our communities, such as healthcare, where under the Obama administration, we were fortunate enough to implement the Affordable Care Act. Many of those provisions were rolled back. Well, today we sit in a global pandemic, and many people are going to be straddled with debt, I think, that we haven't even thought about.
Hmm.
And some of it may be from healthcare. Maybe the CARES Act, I haven't read the entire bill. Maybe some of it does cover healthcare for the pandemic. But all of those things are things that require us to vote to make a
Hmm.
change and make a difference. If we don't vote, those things such as healthcare, such as education, we're allowing our voice to be non-existent. And if we don't fill out a census form, we're allowing our voice to be non-existent. So I think, young people oftentimes are apathetic towards voting, towards civic engagement, because they don't understand the value of it the same way
Hmm.
that the seniors in our community do. But the seniors in our community, you have to remember, as a people, we didn't really get the right to vote to, until what, 1960, the
Hmm.
Voting Rights Act passed. So here we are. That's not too long ago. So many of our seniors, they understand and they value that. But our young folks don't understand and value the voting rights that they have, um, that they have, because they have a sense of entitlement, because
Hmm.
they didn't understand the fight for it. So I think it's our obligation to, one, make sure that the students understand how folks had to fight for that right. And so now
Hmm.
you have an obligation to carry through and make sure that you vote, and you have a civic obligation to make sure you fill out the census report, and then provide clear examples to them of how it impacts and or will affect them if they don't.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of Bloomfield College and our president, Dr. Marquita Evans, who is in a faculty committee meeting right now, which is why she did not hop in on this webinar. But I'm sure she definitely will be checking in. She's very hands-on, very much engaged. So I'm sure she will be circling back on the demand. But I look forward to bringing you on campus, if not for something that we're planning for our graduating seniors. In terms of something commemorative due to the delay of their graduation. Definitely for our student leaders, our freshman class, and I would like to link you to our I was going to call them single ladies, first ladies of Bloomfield College. Forgive me, ladies, first ladies of Bloomfield College. Um, Organization, because I think that I know that you are an inspiration, but you're also a leader of empowerment. And that is something that we want to push and continue to push in the Center for Student Leadership and Engagement, is not just being inspiring to leaders or doing things that are inspiring, but being empowering, giving them the tools and the resources, putting them in the experience to be able to be the change that we expect of them, as those that have been through some things and still have a way to go ourselves, but also as the leaders of tomorrow, as they used to say about us just yesterday. And so tomorrow, I don't know if you know, but thanks to our great partners, community partners, and that's another thing, we are walking the walk. We are bringing in even more community partners. Bloomfield has always been very much engaged. New partnership, thanks to Dr. Lammy and the other officers of the school, with the North Public Schools, and just all around the state. And so we've partnered with Parent Engaging Parents. I'm the founder and chairman of Parent University, New Jersey. And so putting parents before politics and policy before politics is something that I also want to teach to our student leaders on campus. And so tomorrow we want to thank Dr. Lamont, who's the Commissioner of Education for New Jersey, a very important position, not just in this time, but all the time.
Mhm.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe he's the first African American appointed. And as you know, we're celebrating still the appointment of our first African American or Black president,
Mhm.
who's also our first female as well. And so to give up a Friday evening at 7 o'clock. And we said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Absolutely." Is great. And we also have Miss Jarrett, Renee Jarrett, who's with the Vital Village Community Engagement Network. Also, Dr. Beverly Lynn, who is the CEO of Program for Parents. And we talk about parents needing to be partners and
Mhm.
needing to be equipped with tools and resources and transferable skills. And then we also will have Councilwoman Shanika Boucher, who's from Camden, New Jersey, but she's also the president and founder of Social Responsibility Through Me, which does great work. And so this is what we're calling at Bloomfield College and PEP as the virtual community statewide check-in. And I'm just excited that the college that is helping to make this happen is Bloomfield College, because it is showing that Bloomfield is very important in today's world, that folks are paying attention and watching the fact that this institution has changed dramatically, and there's much more that's expected. So if you can join us tomorrow, I know you'll be with the family, and definitely the audience. I know this will be in syndication, so please share. Tomorrow, Friday, April 17th, we are having a special webinar series that will feature our Commissioner of Education. He will have his cabinet present as well to do pretty much a 45-minute spill on the state of affairs. There will be some time for audience to engage and ask some questions statewide, so you can hear what other parents are asking about and dealing with, and how others we can see measure equity, can't we? If the same things are happening throughout the state, so that's one thing. And then he's willing to also have which is why it's pretty much a 3-hour event. But there will be a segment where he'll sort of just do like a one-on-one thing with that'll be moderated by myself and I believe Councilwoman as well, in terms of asking some more intimate questions about specific areas. So if you have any questions, Danielle, or your parents, they can you can forward them to me. We'll ask them an email or just simply encourage them. I'll send you the link today in terms of to register for the webinar. As far as the BC community, uh, by 4 o'clock, you'll be able to check your email. So after 4, check your email and you'll see the registration link. Again, tomorrow, Friday at 4 o'clock. Again, Danielle, we thank you. And we also
Thank
look
you.
forward to having Assemblywoman Angela McKnight on Tuesday for our next virtual engagement series.
Thank you so much,
BC,
Terrence, for doing this.
thank you.
Really appreciate it. It's good, that you are continuing the charge to make sure that we build young people up before they leave college and they understand the value of community service and the value of engagement and engaging and building multiple networks. So thank you for the work that you're doing at Bloomfield.
I'll see you soon, and thank you again. We'll have you on campus soon, hopefully. But if not, we will definitely put you engage you virtually.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone, and thank you for participating.